Welcome to Breaking the Silence of Design, a bi-monthly podcast designed to discuss race and racism, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the design and construction space. My name is Karen Compton, and I am your co-host and founder of A3K Consulting.
And I'm Gabrielle, Bullock, co-host and principal and director of global diversity for Perkins and Will. And today we continue the conversation around accountability with a special guest.
So are you ready? I'm excited.
I'm ready.
So our guest today is the city manager for the City of Glendale. Glendale is the fourth largest city in Los Angeles County based on population now, I believe. As the city's chief executive, Yasmin Beers has 2 decades in her career at the city, which is hard for me to believe. Before that, before becoming city manager, you were deputy city manager, I believe?
Assistant city manager and deputy city manager.
Assistant and deputy city manager, and were responsible for police, fire, public works, library, and I believe
water and power.
And water and power.
Parks.
The whole shebang.
The whole shebang.
So welcome. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you
I
very
really
much.
do. So here we are. Yet again, another episode, more questions, hopefully more answers. So we've got a couple.
There you go, you ready?
I think so.
Okay. Following the murder of George Floyd, the City of Glendale completed its preliminary report on equity, diversity, and inclusion and presented those findings to the City Council on July 21st. Can you talk a little bit about the outcome of that report? And how is it framing the next steps that the city is taking to understand its past and to frame its future?
Sure. First and foremost, thank you for having me here today. It's exciting to have this conversation. A little unnerving, I will be honest, just wanting to share and be present and have that conversation and hopefully learn something as I walk out of here this afternoon. And so prior to the 21st meeting of July with the City Council, we really had to take a step back in the City of Glendale in terms of looking at our past to a certain extent, but not having enough time, honestly, to understand what that past is, but knowing that we needed to do something initially to bring to the forefront the discussion of Mr. Floyd's death and what that meant for us in Glendale before we were able to move forward with any sort of direction from the City Council, having them under one roof at the dais, making their decision points and giving us their feedback was imperative. And so that initial meeting, I think, was a framework of what we really needed in terms of moving forward. And so that included information related to an organization that we felt we could become members of that would provide us with tools, provide us with resources and information, hopefully, and they're known as GARE, Government Alliance for Race and Equity, to provide us with information again and resources to really have a foundation of what it is that we're looking for within the organization before we're able to move forward. So the council, of course, said, absolutely, let's become members, let's utilize the resources available, let's understand where we are today before we can move forward. As part of that conversation, we also included the police department because, of course, police agencies across the nation are the center of much of the discussion. And with our own Glendale Police Department, and as much as I may say we're a great and fantastic police department in terms of the policies that we have in place, in terms of the men and women who provide the services, let's take a step back. Let's look at what our policies and procedures are. Let's study what they are. Attorney General Becerra had information that through the state had put out. We're looking at those. We told the City Council, allow us the time to go look at these policies and procedures before we come back and provide that information to you. And lastly, the importance of reviewing, I think, our historic documents as it relates to the City of Glendale, as it relates to inequality and race, as it relates to the importance, I think, of acknowledging our past before we're able to move forward. So we said to the council, allow us the time to go and study to see what we have in our archives, to understand if Glendale truly was a sundown town, which we have found, yes, absolutely. There are very specific historic documents, experiences in place, and allow us that time to look at all of those documents and then come back and provide that information to you so that you can have a resolution in place that will acknowledge what our past was and allow us the ability to be able to move forward. Actually, that resolution is coming forward to the City Council on September 15th. So we are looking forward to having that conversation with the City Council and that acknowledgement. I think that will be very important.
And is the larger community aware of the efforts that Glendale is making at the moment?
Very good question. Larger community. We have put information out on our social media platforms, any media platform that you can think of, newsletters, etc. There are very specific groups who are interested in this information, from the school district to Big, Black in Glendale, to a coalition that has come together from a number of different industries in the city of Glendale, who have made it a point to make this a focal point in terms of what they are looking at. So they're all aware, but when you say larger, you know, I always wonder how far-reaching is our social media kind of push, and are we able to get that information as out as we need to? It's a good question. It's a good question. I remain optimistic, but I know that we can always do more.
Sure.
The city is such a diverse and very different experience because the central downtown portion of Glendale is certainly one key area, but then there's the northern part kind of towards La Crescenta, where we're still part of the community in the city of Glendale, but the communication doesn't necessarily reach as far to the north. And so I think the question about how far do those efforts actually reach is really a good one to the broader context of the community. But you're still pretty early on in this exploration. So what have you learned so far in this process? Because you're really, really early on in terms of taking a look at what the city's historical past is and really kind of analyzing data and information. So what have you learned so far?
I'll tell you from the perspective, from a personal perspective, let me start by saying that you often think that you are a good listener, and that you allow another side, whatever that side may be, to be heard before kind of determining the steps you need to take to move forward. And so I, from a personal perspective, think that I was very reactionary initially in terms of knowing that we as an organization needed to respond. And that response over that weekend, I believe, was something that I think was extremely important based on what you're putting forward, outward facing to the community. And so from having conversations with the police chief and saying, you know, I think we ought to put out a statement, not only written, but video. Mm-hmm. So we got on that within hours. And concurrently with the mayor of the city, as the representative of the legislative body, making sure that there was a statement from the mayor, representative of the council, again, written as well as in video format, and then sending a message out to the organization the following week. And so it felt reactionary. I think we did things right based on messaging initially. I do think that we could have taken more, I could have taken maybe a little more time before putting a message out by way of my newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Not that the information was necessarily bad, just order of information could have been possibly different had I maybe taken a step back. And I truly, truly believe The listening piece has been front and center for me and many others who are part of my team, because we had a very open and to a certain extent emotional dialogue about the varying degrees of emotions related to wanting to protect my police department, because I know the men and women who are out there on a daily basis protecting our community, but also knowing that it's bigger than us. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily about me, it's not about my organization, but it's about what's happening around us. It's about our history, and that realization of the acknowledgement of what has occurred before being able to move forward was a bit of a eye-opener for me, because I thought, well, you know, this body of the city council hasn't necessarily done anything bad. They don't have policies in place that is not inclusive. They're not the folks who were exclusive, you know, that wouldn't allow all walks of life in. So why is it that they have to deal with it? Well, you know, take a breath, Yasmin, think about what you're thinking, and understand before you speak. Mm-hmm. I don't have to always have the answer, and I sure as heck don't. And I've learned that through this process, and I'm still learning. And that's why I came today, honestly, because I want to continue to learn, and I want to share what I've learned in terms of taking that breath.
So you talked a little bit about Glendale being a sundown town. Mm-hmm. And some people don't even know what a sundown town is. Why don't you explain what it is? What did you learn about Glendale, just kind of briefly, and then kind of a little bit about next steps?
You know, what's interesting is, you know, I've seen movies, right? And I've cried and I've hurt during that movie, and then it's gone. Because I haven't experienced that.
Right.
I've experienced other forms of injustice that I think, being an immigrant individual from Iran, and experiencing certain things because of the timing of which I came to the United States. But it's nothing as it relates to a sundown town. And you know, interestingly, as we have looked at the archives for Glendale, difficult to necessarily find any particular laws that were in place that, you know, somebody signed on to, or council had policy that said you're a sundown town, but it was practice. Yeah. It was the unspoken. It was, you know, you're not to be in the city of Glendale, you know, after the sun goes down.
Right.
And through time, and I've been part of this organization in Glendale for 33 years, and, you know, grew up in Glendale from high school. It's not something that we learned in school.
Right.
It's not something related to Glendale that was spoken about. And so what I've realized is there's so much information that's out there related to just Glendale. I mean, imagine across California and the United States what that means, and the different experiences that were in place in terms of not being accepted, not being allowed to be in a city after the sun goes down. And God knows what it was possibly like when the sun was up.
Right.
Right? And you hear different stories, anecdotes. Again, I wasn't there, I didn't experience it, but knowing that it was in place, and knowing that the city council is they're very much looking forward to that acknowledgement, which is, I think, the first step. It's that acknowledgement piece to say, yes, it was part of our history.
So one of the things I told Christine Powers was that part of the insidiousness of racism is that it's not just about what's in policy, because that's what's written on a piece of paper. It's as much about what people practice and what has become normative behavior, what has become acceptable within an organization or a department or a group of people. And the fact that colleagues, peers have those normative behaviors unwritten, that enforce a certain type of exclusionary behavior is what supports the fabric of racism, and that makes it difficult to document. So then from your standpoint, you're having to deal with what is not documented but is experienced.
It's experienced.
Which is as important, right? You know, some say if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist. Well, that's hogwash, right? It's how people behave, you know, as you say, from an organization to a city to a state even, right? So.
Absolutely. And I think the piece about the unwritten policy, that's why it's taken us some bit of time to put pieces together so that we're accurate, because we are a government entity. We're a municipal, local government entity. And when you have a legislative body, there's 5 of them, who come from, you know, 5 different backgrounds with 5 different thoughts, who are representing 200,000+ people, you want to get it as right as possible, while you're acknowledging it appropriately, and that apology needs to be in place for us, I think, to be able to take some of the next steps, which include a historical context. I think that is also part of the September 15th conversation, is for council to allow us to put out a request for proposal for companies to come in and provide us with a historical context related to the City of Glendale and its racist history, and what does that mean. Initially, we thought we would do that internally, but I truly believe it's something that we should have a third party look at. We can provide information, but there are people who are trained to do this work, and we ought to allow them to help us. And so we will also be asking the City Council to help us appropriate some funds aside for that to be able to move forward.
Great.
You had a question, though.
Yes, I sure do.
She came prepared. She
I
had
did,
her list.
and I wrote it
She had her
down.
list and she wrote it down and everything.
So how would you to envision Glendale moving forward with a plan to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion? Right back at you.
Right back at you. Well,
Help me understand a little better.
I'll go first.
Okay, you go first.
I think you're starting in the right place. I mean, acknowledging your history of Glendale, acknowledging the history of Glendale, and then trying to rectify it for the future. Now, how you make that known to everybody outside of Glendale, that Glendale is welcoming, will take some time, right? So it's changing culture. And I think it starts with what you're doing. And I would suggest that to get to a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable community, that you engage your current communities in what you're doing. When you engage the third parties to explore the culture, engage the communities, because if you feel part of the solution, like as an architect, if we engage the community in designing with us, instead of us designing for them, then there's buy-in, there's pride, and they get to shape their own community. I think that's where I would start. I don't have all the answers because, you know, I'm used to dealing with an organization, but this is a city. But I'm impressed that you and the city have acknowledged the historical barriers, racial barriers, discriminatory barriers, perhaps. And so rely on your community, give them voice. And I don't know if there's several different cultural and racial groups in Glendale. How do they get along? Are there what, you know, I'm a New Yorker, so here I am in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is really big, and what I see are enclaves. And when I hear the term enclave, and I gave it that name, I see separate. And so I think a struggle for large counties, cities, is to how do you maintain the identity and cultural connection to a neighborhood and a community, but also be welcoming for others to visit. Glendale has lots to offer that LA doesn't have. So how do we, I think it's a question for everybody, How do we invite others to enjoy our cities? Not necessarily come in and gentrify it, but just come in and enjoy it, and also maintain the cultural identity of the various groups.
So I have a kind of a expanse on that. I think it's important to acknowledge that a city is the creation of community. And community is a combination of housing, parks, education. It's a place where people live and work because they feel safe and because they feel welcome. Architecture then puts a bow on that. It puts a bow on the experience that people have. So I think it's really important for the city to define and form partnerships with the school, because I know we've had a lot of struggles on the school side of the equation as well, but forming those partnerships with the business community, with schools, with healthcare providers, in order for the city as a whole, because it's not just the city, the government, it's the city as a whole, the experience of the city as a whole that residents actually feel and that people feel when they're there. So it's kind of through that lens that I offer the following thought. Part of what I believe is going to come through in your resolution is a discussion about redlining. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us don't really truly understanding how insidious redlining was, how clear redlining was not just about housing. It was about making investments or not making investments in certain areas. And it was a tool that banks used, that underwriters used, insurance companies, everybody used this tool 70 years ago, quite frankly. But the behaviors that went along with it still exist to this day. So in terms of making Glendale more welcoming, I would love to see economic development in the city of Glendale, really to reach out to people of color, to encourage them to start businesses within the city. But I also think the city needs to look at workforce housing. Mm-hmm. We have some of the most expensive property there is in Los Angeles County. Glendale's done a great job at creating housing, but most of our development is in what I call the north portion of Glendale. If I go to the south portion of Glendale, which most people don't know the geography, which is south of Colorado, where we have a lot of racial diversity, we haven't had very much economic opportunity. We haven't had very much economic expansion. Housing is still a challenge. Parks are still really a challenge. Education and services are really still a challenge. So if I were to look at it holistically and say, how do we create a community that's more inclusive? I think we have to look at the pieces of that community and pull it together and be willing to put it all on the table and have a discussion. Unfortunately, the basis of that was redlining.
You know, I'm just gonna, there was the city of Seattle several years ago put in place a new policy around social equity, and they evaluated and changed every single policy of the city to make sure that the barriers to inclusiveness, to diversity, to equity were torn down. I mean, from who's doing the work, who's building the projects, who's hiring, what are they hiring, what's the makeup? I mean, so they looked at their entire city operations and how work gets done under the social equity lens, and actually developed a social equity toolkit. So you might want to look at that.
Check that out.
City of Seattle.
We'll absolutely look at that, because I think it has to be looked at. Every policy that's in place, and I think the organization that we've partnered with has actually worked with the City of Seattle as well, and they may be able to share some information with us, but I do believe that all layers, nothing should be off the table, basically, and we ought to look at that. I do have a follow-up question, if you could, and it has to do with the policy areas. You know, what kind of policy areas would you focus on, or what are some specific things that you would like to see throughout this process? And I'm very curious, if you were to pick a few policy areas to focus on, what would they be?
Who's going first?
I always go to housing first. Quality of
foundation.
housing, where is it? Is it accessible? Is it equitable? And then I would go to workforce. You know, where are the jobs?
Missing
And-
middle piece for us, I truly believe, is workforce housing in Glendale. It's something that we do miss.
We're clearly missing the workforce housing piece. I mean, I totally agree with Gabrielle. I would go directly to the housing component. I don't think from a policy perspective, we've really truly looked at the development of workforce housing. But I'm also real curious, kind of going back to a comment that Gabrielle just made, about the policies and practices within recruitment and retention. I'm a true believer that we should put everything on the table. Policies, practices, norms, and do what I would call a zero-based analysis. To this point in time, my experience of policy and practice has been we just put a Band-Aid on the last thing that we did and move forward. But we never really take a step back and go, but why does this exist to begin with? I would take a zero-based approach and say, you know, let's just put all of our practices for recruitment, retention, policing, housing, put economic development, put it all on the table. Nothing really becomes off limits. And then let's piece by piece, part by part, have a discussion around, but why do we continue to do this? What are the reasons why we continue to do it? And if there really is no basis for it, and it really only creates a barrier, both real or perceived, then we shouldn't do it anymore. And I think historically, we just, as cities and counties, we just have not really taken that kind of approach.
And I like to look at it as challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
Every line by line.
Yeah.
And once you look at everything you do, you're like, is that status quo? What? That's not good. We shouldn't be doing that way. Let's do it something else. But it really takes, you know, looking in that proverbial mirror.
And it's
very
uncomfortable.
carefully. Yeah.
People
But it
get
can be
uncomfortable.
exciting.
But it, absolutely, very exciting,
Yeah.
especially when you feel that you have been able to effectuate some sort of positive change. But at the same time can be very uncomfortable for folks in departments because they don't know any better, or maybe they haven't thought about it. But I think it's important, absolutely.
Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. And I shared this with you before kind of coming today. And the reason why I said yes is because I was uncomfortable. And I am a true believer to put yourself in situations where you may not be the subject matter expert, though I like to be in most cases where if I'm representing something. But in a scenario such as this, it's uncomfortable, and I don't want to misspeak or misrepresent my city in any way. But at the same time, I know the importance of this conversation. And Karen, you and I go back some years, and we've had a number of conversations, and most recently, really taking the time to call you to ask for your advice is that part where I've really felt as though, okay, you have to again slow down and listen, and don't feel that you have don't feel that you have all the answers moving forward, and use your the village, the people in your village to help you and help your organization succeed. And so my final thoughts are, be bold, be brave, don't be afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations, because it can be exciting, as uncomfortable as it may be, because we're here. And if we don't do it, then who will? And will our kids have to then continue to deal with some of the injustices that have been in place? I don't want to leave that for my kids if I don't have to.
I appreciate
and so, yeah.
I appreciate
you.
you being here.
Thank you.
I thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Breaking the Silence of Design. I'm Karen Compton, your co-host.
And I want to thank you, our followers, for subscribing and joining us, and you can continue the conversation on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So join us next time when we continue the difficult conversations with a new guest. Thank you.
Thank you.